Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, a podcast where we read books that are about archaeology but anyone can enjoy. I'm your host, Tristan Herenstein, and as always, I'm here with my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hey, everybody.
Today, we're moving on to the next city in the book we're reading right now called Four Lost Cities, A Secret History of the Urban Age by Annalee Newitz. Last time, we talked about Catalhayuk, one of the very first urban environments the first urban environment in human history. And this time we're jumping up quite a ways to the city of Pompeii, the famous city that we've been talking about last time that we're kind of excited to look into here. So everybody knows the most common narrative of Pompeii. It was a Roman city. Volcanic eruption happened. Everyone died and it was buried and lost for a long time. And actually we're finding, of course, as is true in history so often, the reality is a lot more complicated than that. Before we dive in, I want to take a moment and say that if you're enjoying this podcast, please give us a like, a review, a 5-star rating, whatever is appropriate for the platform you're listening or watching this on. It helps us get out there so people can discover us and helps us also get some feedback so that we know that people are liking it and what you're enjoying. Also, before we dive in, I want to take a moment and make sure that you're aware that this is going to be less safe for work than normal. There's a whole chapter dedicated to stuff that's not safe for work. And I just want everyone to be aware that we're not going to go crazy with it, but it's also just, it's Rome. And, you just think of all the stereotypes of Rome. And that's basically what we have to deal with this time. So just be aware of that. So yeah, diving in, we've got chapter 4. And it's titled Ride on the Via dell'Abbondanza, which is my best guess on how it's pronounced.
That's how I would pronounce it.
And so this is essentially, at least the first half of it was to give us kind of a scene setting for Pompeii. And one thing I wasn't really aware of the distinction, there is a current city of Pompeii.
Yeah, I didn't know this either.
Yeah. So if you look it up, make sure if you want the historic Pompeii, make sure there's 2 eyes at the end. If you want the current city, only 1 eye. But you'll probably get both either way.
And it's funny that the book differentiates that. I have a friend who is currently in Rome. She's an archaeologist and she studies Roman archaeology. And she posted a picture saying she was in Pompeii with 2 eyes, but it didn't look like the ancient city. So I got thoroughly confused. So Please don't get confused or upset.
Or confuse Barbara.
Yeah. If you Google and you get one or the other, because I think they're maybe somewhat used interchangeably, or it's not well known that there's a difference.
Right. So Pompeii, population-wise, is actually a similar size to Catalhayuk. We're talking about 15,000 people then. I'm a little curious if they're including the tourist population, because this was quite a tourist town, I guess.
Which I didn't know that.
Right. Right.
But yeah, it was a resort city.
The idea of a
time.
Tourist town in ancient Rome is intriguing.
Yeah.
Yeah. The city, I didn't know when it was discovered. I assumed it was 20th century, but actually it was discovered in the 1700s. So it's actually a pretty ancient archaeological site. And as we'll see, I think later on, or if you're following along, there's signs of interference from all these other time periods throughout. So it's very interesting to see how some of that was done too.
I do like how she talks about the archaeology of archaeology,
right,
and how archaeology has changed throughout time.
Because in the 1700s and really the 1800s, archaeology didn't really exist.
Yeah.
It wasn't a thing.
Honestly, you could even bring that into the early 1900s if you really think about it.
1930s and 1950s is when it really started to get going. As you've probably heard, of course, Pompeii ruins were really well preserved, and this was notable and still is notable because a lot of the other Roman ruins have been built over or have just, been exposed and decayed over time, and this is not as much the case with Pompeii.
And I know we all know the end of Pompeii, but I didn't realize that it wasn't originally a Roman city.
Right. Yeah, you think Italy, it's going to be all Rome, whereas in fact, early Rome wasn't all Italy.
Yeah, and I guess it's Samnites. Am I saying that right?
That's my best guess.
Okay, but it was originally ruled by the Samnites and was taken by Rome in 80 BCE. And a lot of the temples were converted and things like that. But there was still a Samnite community that was able to like worship, and they
Right.
worshiped their own deities and things like that. And there was graffiti in their language, which I guess is Oscan. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right
I have
as
no idea
well.
on that one. So you're braver than me. And for anyone listening, in case you aren't aware, BCE and CCE are common ways of referring to basically BC and AD now. Essentially, it's what is accepted around the world at the moment, at least. So when we say BCE, it means BC, and CCE would be AD. So you're aware of how that's working.
And it's, BCE is before the Common Era.
Yes. And so the Samnites, actually the city of Pompeii started around the 4th century BCE. So it had been around quite a while. And what Rome was doing early on, I know, was they would basically make subservient states. I'm not sure that's the correct term, but essentially they conquered, but, we'll let you kind of do your own thing. Just give us money or tithe to us, and we'll let that be. So they weren't directly ruling them until they finally conquered. And essentially the Samnites and some other these communities decided they wanted more rights, and Rome didn't want to give it to them and conquered them. And now that's a Roman city. But as you said, still has a lot of vestiges of that pre-Rome culture.
And as we mentioned, it was like an ancient resort community. A lot of wealthier Romans had beach houses, which to me, it's like weird to think of ancient people having beach houses, but I guess it makes sense, right?
Right.
But that led to Pompeii being very diverse, I guess. A lot of immigrants lived there.
Particularly from North Africa.
Yeah, which I thought was very fascinating because I would have never thought that. But there was even a temple of Isis, which is an Egyptian goddess, within Pompeii. Apparently that was all the rage.
Right.
It was trendy to worship Isis among rich Roman women.
Yeah. I guess that we have those trends kind of today too, with celebrities and things. Like it becomes trendy to do this religion or that religion. That was a thing, at least in the 90s it was.
Well, even if you look early on in like the 1920s and 30s, there was all this rage about Egypt. And that was around the time that like King Tut's tomb was discovered and things. So I guess this comes from the North African influence, but it just seems like Egyptian fascination is a cyclical thing in history, which Egypt is cool, though. I get it.
Yep. And so in the book, the author is kind of wandering around Pompeii, kind of avoiding the major crowds, which I can sympathize. I think I would probably do the same thing. And she's particularly interested in this African influence. And then out of nowhere, like Batman, appears an archaeologist to answer some questions, which I thought was pretty funny. And so they have this conversation about, how African. So there's a lot of Greek and Roman imagery too, but there's also just a significant amount of African imagery, as we talked about. Some are positive. However, there are others that we would definitely define as racist today. Bigoted, at least, I would say, would be an appropriate term. And so there's a whole, range of interpretation and presentations of these other cultures within Rome. There's one famous one in particular talking about Solomon's judgment, which apparently is just what we call it because we are, as a Western cultures, are familiar with that story. But it's actually probably a very similar story relating to an Egyptian king. And in this case, they have all the roles played by African pygmies. And this is definitely not one of the complimentary depictions, I guess.
Yeah, when you think about any group of people that, you have a bunch of diverse backgrounds in it, of course, there's going to be some contention.
Tension, yeah.
And it was just interesting to read about this in an ancient context because we hear about it so often in a modern context.
Right.
And this was the same but different, really. Some of it made me a little uncomfortable, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, for sure. And I wonder what it was like in Pompeii. Were there people pushing back against this? Was it even something discussed ever, I'm just kind of curious. I'm not sure we have any answer to that. Oh, there's also a lot of what they call Punic influences. So you might be aware of Rome's war with Carthage and everything. So there's actually some Carthage influence through the coins, through a fermented fish sauce called garum, and in the architecture itself.
Yeah,
which,
the tea bricklaying style,
yeah,
which was actually referred to as Africanum.
yeah. So they had their own name for it, and they even that name implied where it came from. So a bit like Catahayuk, we then focus on a particular home. In this case, we'll do it on quite a few homes because we think we have more to work with. But the one we focus on here is Julia Felix.
What's interesting about Julia Felix is for most of the structures, the names of the inhabitants are unknown and the buildings are referred to based on the art found inside. For example, House of the Tragic Poet or House of the Surgeon are both references to art or items that they found inside the house. And this one, they actually do know who the owner is, or at least probably the owner, I guess, Julia Felix, because of an advertisement painted on the outside of the house, which I wrote a note in my book that says, how cool would it be to find that as an archaeologist? Because
Right.
so often, like one of the benefits to archaeology is telling the story of like the common people. And I think the author does a really good job talking about that. But to find like something that says, this is who this belonged to, like we don't always get that. We rarely get that. And so I thought that was really neat.
Yeah, I noticed that, like you said, we named the houses based on the art or other references, and like that's like we might have heard us talk about that with other cases too, where we don't have names for groups of people. They often get names associated with sometimes who discovered them, though that's less common anymore. I'd say more with the a modern place that's nearby.
Yeah.
And in this case, when you're trying to parse out like individual homes, then you have to find a way of identifying them and talking about them. They need a name so you can talk about them, basically.
And the fact that it was a female is
Right.
really cool. And we'll get into that a little bit
Yes.
too.
So the book moves into a lot of detailed description of the estate, which didn't have the same impact for me as Catalhayuk. What did help was actually if you look online and search in the house of Julia Felix, you can find a map of the estate. And that helps kind of bring it together for me a lot. It's a nice description. It's just, I think it's a lot more complicated than the Catalhayuk home was.
It was a whole estate,
Right.
essentially. I mean, there were gardens and bathhouses and
Practically a strip mall.
yeah, and there was like taverns, essentially. I
Yeah.
mean, this was quite the place.
Yeah, and it had been converted to do this too, because it had been an estate where a wealthy person lived, and then they think Julia Felix was actually converting it to be almost like we said, more of a strip mall, more of a commercial residence.
Which is a theme you see throughout the history of Pompeii when we discuss it more. And
Right.
later on, you'll see that that's a trend that was occurring in the ancient city. But what I found fascinating is the fact that women had to manage property through a guardian, which was usually their father.
Sometimes.
Right. But it doesn't appear that that is how Julia did it, according to the ad, because it mentions her father, but says that she owns the property and will be doing the negotiations herself. The ad is for, I think, tenants.
Right.
And it says that she will be discussing it directly, not going through her father. But there's something called the Julian laws, where a woman who was born free could earn the right to manage her own property by having 3 children. And a freed woman, meaning a previous slave, had to have 4 children, which I was like, okie dokie.
Yeah.
But we really, I guess, if I remember correctly, we don't know if there's no evidence to say whether Julia had any children or not. There was a skeleton found, but the sex has not been determined.
Yeah, and there was a lot of conjecture I felt for some of this too. Assuming Julia was from money, which I thought was reasonable. Yes, and she would have likely married young, probably also reasonable. Possibly had a couple husbands by the time she was in her 20s. How that was completely out of left field. You have no way.
I don't know how
gauging that.
how they came to that determination. To be honest,
Yeah.
yeah.
They did say wars made young brides and divorce was widely accepted, but still, I felt like that was, unless you have records that most wealthy women or women of this class would have had multiple husbands through divorce or wars. I don't know. I just didn't feel like it was supported enough for me to like really buy into that.
Yeah, it seemed like a lot of conjecture. It paints an interesting story, but I don't know that we can make that determination about Julia.
Mm-hmm. And then we go into a lot of detail on the Julian laws too, which was interesting. I'm glad I read it, but it didn't quite see how it fit the overall point of this book too. It felt like a little soapbox moment, which isn't nothing wrong with that necessarily. I don't know if you felt it fit quite as well
I
too.
I feel like a lot of the conjecture about Julia kind of segued into that, and I'm
Yeah,
wondering if that was the author's purpose because I mean, it's interesting, it's fascinating, especially being a woman, thinking that you could only manage property if you had children
right,
and things. It's just kind of, I wrote in the book, ew, gross.
right.
But I did find it interesting that divorce was also widely accepted in the Roman culture, but this is early Roman culture. But yeah, I mean, I guess it was interesting. She talks about how the Julian laws were actually great for women. It allowed women to take more power and move freely throughout the public and domestic sphere. So I think maybe her point was setting the stage for what was to come in Pompeii. She also talks about the theater and how Nero poured money into the theater, which allowed for more women performers and producers and patrons. So I think she's kind of setting the stage for the fact that gender roles are kind of being reimagined a little
Hmm.
bit. And this allowed for women like Julia to make a living without necessarily depending upon men, or at least depending upon men less so.
Right. After you've had a few kids anyway.
Right. And she also talks about how this provided business opportunities for women. It was interesting to me, the discussion about how backyard theaters provided business opportunities for
That's true.
women.
Yeah.
She talks about how to entertain guests, they wealthier Pompeians would have backyard theater productions, and a lot of these performances were done during alfresco dinners, and it changed the public perception of women's roles. It offered them opportunities to produce these performances, to perform in these performances, and also to be parts of what they called mime troupes.
Hmm.
And they talk about one specifically, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce her name.
Yeah, there was a popular story they reference too, where Hercules gets drunk with a African queen. I forget where exactly, and puts on her clothes, and then she puts on his clothes. And the depiction is often with her sitting in the position of the dominant male of the household, which is kind of a challenging of gender roles. There's a lot of subtext, I think, in this effort and how things are being rewritten and adjusted.
Yeah, and like they even talk later about, and I won't get into it too much right now, but prostitution. One thing I find interesting is just the art and how women and men as well use these frescoes and paintings and graffiti to assert themselves and kind of establish cultural change. It was very fascinating to me, and I think we still use art in that way a lot of times.
Yeah. Here, I didn't quite get this. It also talks a bit about Julia's mother, which I'm not clear. I thought we only had that advertisement to go off of. How do we know who her mother was?
Yeah, I for some reason that didn't click with me, but now that you say that, I'm sitting here a little confused, like, yeah,
I'm a little unclear on
I
that,
don't,
but
yeah, I that's a good
essentially,
question.
somehow that we're not clear on, her mother was not born an aristocrat, but was involved in a powerful organization called the Augustales, which was a basically organization supporting freed slaves. Sounds like it was a political organization because slaves weren't able to be directly involved with politics, but the organization basically could do a lot on their behalf. So you couldn't get individual political power as a freed slave, but as an organization, you like a guild or or something where you band together, and that gives you a lot more.
The whole conversation about freed slaves and the system surrounding them was pretty fascinating to me. They could, once freed, they had a patron, which was usually their former owner, and
Yeah,
they were able to run independent businesses and things like that, but they would help support the estate. A lot of times they would stay with their patron, their former owner, and it was called the patronage system. So the patrons would lose human property, but gain a loyal worker whose fortunes were tied to their household. So the liberty, as I guess they were called, the freed slaves were free, but not free.
Right.
They couldn't vote, they couldn't hold political power, but they had the opportunity with a good patron to move up, and their children could potentially be more free, I guess, and could vote and earn status through civic organizations and things. It's very strange.
It's kind of slavery with benefits.
Yeah.
It was still sounded like you weren't really free.
Yeah, it was, again, kind of made me cringe, but
maybe you had some more rights, and maybe the patron had responsibilities towards you, whereas it may not have been the case before.
The closest comparison I could come up with, and it's definitely not a perfect comparison, but was like tenant farming after the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what came to my mind, although very different.
There's a lot of other things, a lot of other factors involved in that.
Yeah.
There's a good talk about the tombs, I thought, which is one of our favorite subjects.
Yeah.
So headstones for the Romans were placed outside city walls, partly for visitor reasons, but also so that visitors could learn about the prominent individuals in the city. And that's, one of your favorite things, I know, is go to a community and look at the cemetery and see which names you see a lot of, and that kind of gives you an indication of some of the history of that community.
Yep, I always tell people that cemeteries are outdoor museums.
Yep. I liked also when they were in the House of the Mosaic Columns. Again, we're just going with names of things. And this was when we kind of start talking about a bit of the archaeology of archaeology, because they're doing an excavation of this, which this is one of the first places that they found. And they found columns with these beautiful mosaics on it that are actually not there anymore. They're in the Naples Museum. And for whatever reason, they replaced them with 4 really crummy concrete columns that were the wrong size in the wrong place. And the archaeologists just kind of laughed, and I don't even know why they bothered.
Yeah, he calls them, and I quote, bizarre, crappy concrete things.
Yeah. But these were, I think this was one of the things they would have done in the 1800s.
Well, I know it says it. They're poor reconstructions from like the early to mid 1900s.
Okay.
Which I found interesting because that's around the time that a lot of like in fashion you see a lot of Roman influence and Egyptian influence and things like that.
It's also a time when the idea of doing reconstructions was at its peak.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of reconstructions you'll find from that era, and you'll find that things that have been interpreted more recently less frequently have a reconstruction.
But, and it's, of course, they have a really good conversation with the archaeologist, which I really appreciate, where he's talking about how early archaeology was interested in the wealthy and the opulence of the lifestyle of people of the past. But today we're more interested in the ordinary people. And we see that as the strength of archaeology, is to tell the story of those that aren't the Julius Caesars of the world. And he has a great quote. It says, "To me, it isn't about the Julius Caesars and people we know too much about already. It's the people we don't know anything about." And I just love the people we know too much about already.
Right. Enough of those guys.
Yeah. We want to know about the regular folk.
Yeah. And so in this case, they kind of talk about that by looking at the kitchen where the slaves in liberty would have worked. In this particular House of Mosaic Columns, it was actually a pretty impressive kitchen, I guess. And they even wondered that it was actually the kitchen itself might have hosted guests, which I'm a little unclear on why they thought that as well.
I guess maybe just the size.
I guess.
I wish there was an illustration or a map or something of this, because I was having a difficult time kind of rolling it around in my brain.
These structures are so complicated.
Yeah.
So if you're reading along, maybe do yourself a favor and look up a map when you get to these parts and look up these houses. I think that would have helped us out a little bit.
Yeah.
It describes it as 3 stories above the street, which I thought was an interesting way of saying it, because it's not necessarily a 3-story building. Right. Because there was actually a false hill that they built. And then there was a slight overhang on the sidewalk, was basically, I think they said, designed so that people could, on the upper level, be dining and stuff and have a view of the ocean and don't have to see all the dirty poor people on the street.
Right.
Well, that just makes sense. And then below that, on that overhang, next to the sidewalk, would have been shops, again, run by a lot of the Liberty. And I think there's bronze workers, food stalls, bars, etc.
Hmm.
In those kinds of areas.
Another thing that interested me about the kitchen was the running water.
Mm.
Of course, lead pipes, Rome. But
Refitted with lead pipes, they
yeah,
said.
yeah. So it's interesting to me that I guess when plumbing became available in the ancient world, they were like, oh, let's upgrade our kitchen,
Right.
which seems like such a modern concept to me.
Well, we'll talk about it, but even some bathrooms or toilets had running water, which is cool.
Yeah. Oh, and there was they talked about I mean, we're in Florida, so we're familiar with arguments and disagreements over beach access. Apparently that's not necessarily something new. The rich folk they had these villas and they created artificial pond fish tank situations. And these artificial ponds, I guess, blocked access to the beach for local fishermen. And it became a very political hot button issue in ancient Pompeii. And I know there was some concessions made, but
Yeah, after Mount Vesuvius erupted, there's a fisherman that took it to the emperor at the time to intervene, but basically he sided with the rich people.
yeah, yeah. And I was just like, wow, we really do repeat history.
Yeah, yeah, it's a very familiar debate there, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right, so moving on into chapter 5, titled What We Do in Public, is all about the fun stuff we referenced at the start. To start this chapter off, she does talk about how disasters in Pompeii were not a new thing, which kind of helps bring to focus how dramatic the Mount Vesuvius eruption really was, because in 62 CE, the whole Bay of Naples area experienced an earthquake that leveled a whole bunch of the city. And so, a lot of people, of course, didn't come back, but a lot of them did. And there was a big recovery effort by Emperor Nero even to fund reconstruction and help people of the city.
And it was interesting to me because prior to the earthquake, it was a big vacation destination, and that kind of this eruption or earthquake impacted that negatively. It became less of a vacation destination. And I was just thinking about the hurricanes in Florida. That's what came to mind for me.
I felt the vacation destination focus shifted.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
it was for all the rich people to get with their villas. And then afterwards, it sounds like it almost becomes more of a common person vacation destination.
Yeah, it was like more shopping, and the villas turned into more like mixed use spaces. There were laundries, bakeries, tabernas, which I guess are like bar and restaurant.
Lots of tabernas.
Yeah.
A lot of redesign of property.
Yeah, I love too that there were some of the restoration efforts. There was some work done to some of the buildings that was thought to be earthquake proof. But she didn't really go into that, and I would have loved to know more about that.
The way it was phrased made it sound like it would not have been.
Right, yeah. So I would just love to hear more about what they did, what they thought it would do, compared especially to what we do now.
There were extra thick walls, if I remember right. And as, when we think of earthquake proof, we don't think of harder. We think of more flexible, I think.
I know. When I was reading it, I was like, that just sounds like more rubble.
More things to fall on top of you. Yes.
Yeah. But one thing I found absolutely fascinating is there were a variety of stores. And the stores would be kind of on the bottom level, like we talked about. And then upstairs would be these nice multi-use kind of villa situations. And there were even shops that sold hot water.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would love to know the details of how that worked. What did they carry the hot water home in, and how long did it stay hot?
And how hot did they need it? Were they drinking the hot water? Was that what, or was
I think
it
was
for cooking?
for cooking.
It was just really,
But I'm like,
these things.
it does show the kind of typical opulence of Rome, though. Like, oh, I'm too lazy to boil my own water. I'm going to go to the boiled water store.
Right.
And get my boiled water for my soup.
Even to us, that seems ridiculous.
It really does.
So talking about the tabernus or the bars, so apparently Pompeii had over 160 of these things.
Yeah. And
Which means,
this is what they've found so far.
Yeah.
And they have not excavated nearly all of Pompeii. No. So you can imagine there was tons of these places.
But the estimate is that then that 1/10 of the people had to be eating out all the time to sustain that number, which is kind of mind-boggling. But it also is interesting because there's some parallels with modern societies in that a healthy city often has a lot of restaurants. And so that is, when I say healthy, I mean economically healthy.
Right. Yeah.
And so they think that is what we're seeing here. But, it's not the rich people going out and doing that. That's when we get into what they refer to as the middlers.
Middlers. Yeah.
They didn't want to use middle class because it has certain connotations, but as they kept describing the middlers, I just thought it sounded like the middle class, personally.
Right. They weren't rich, but they weren't poor. They earned money by working essentially in businesses or in a trade. Trade was considered taboo for the elites. And one thing they mentioned is that modest dwellings, like lower income dwellings, didn't have kitchens usually.
Right.
So that explains why they would have frequented the tabernas a lot.
Yeah. So then we're going to move into a few specific buildings. First up is the Foulerie of Stephanus, which was one of the buildings rebuilt after a quake, and a bit like the house of Julia Felix was an elite house and then was turned into a different thing, like you said, multi-use. So in this case, they turned it into a wool processing workshop. And we have the name Stephanus, and again in a similar way, because there's an election-related sign near the entrance. They're not certain that the baker working there was named Stephanus, but the book straight up said, "We will assume it was," which I thought was an odd assumption to make.
Yeah, I was thinking about this because if you think about political elections, and this is me thinking about it in modern terms, posters, flyers, billboards, any type of advertisement shows up everywhere. Like a lot of people have advertisements for candidates they support outside of their home. So what's to say that Rome, in ancient Rome, they didn't do similar things? So again, I thought it was kind of a stretch, but I'm glad they at least make mention of the fact that
we don't know for sure.
We don't know for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
It seemed like an unnecessary stretch too. Like you could just refer to the baker, that's the only baker we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
But it's all right. They converted the atrium, which is the atrium is a open space with a pool basically for collecting rainwater. It was a big publicly visible space usually that was also there to, as a show of wealth basically. And so they converted this area into an area with large rooms, and they would use for tubs and tools for working with wool. They also had room for domestic life, so people were living there. No idea if it was the shop owner or anything, but basically they found jewelry and cosmetics and cookware and that kind of thing, all signs that people were actually living there, not just working in this location. So again, multi-use, more complicated in its use, I would say, than just rich people live there. Next, we move to the House of Chaste Lovers, which we don't need to spend a lot of time on, but it's another example of a repurposed villa. In this case, it was built into a big bakery and included millstones and ovens, and it even turned the private rooms, into a stable for his mules that pulled the millstone. And again, it had all the living spaces and working spaces in the same area. And so this was part of the retail revolution in this case, during they had a period of peace right now, and they were moving from crafting on an individual scale to a larger scale, and the trade networks were getting more and more extensive as well. So they're trading all over the place.
Yeah, Africa, Asia, the Middle East.
Right.
Very, very extensive trade networks.
Even some of the tabernas, which I think they described this earlier. So the tabernas were either like a single little room or they were multi-room things. So think of just like all this difference between like a street vendor to a restaurant, basically.
One thing they talked about that I just found absolutely strange is dining beds. The elites would dine on dining beds, which in my mind, I didn't Google this or anything, but in my mind, I kind of think of as like a chaise lounge type situation.
I think of I forget his name right now, the god of wine and parties, though. He's always kind of reclining on a... Yeah.
But it's just such a weird concept to me. One thing that was interesting, and it's kind of going back to archaeology and how it's changed over time, is how Victorian prejudices kind of influenced archaeology. They didn't really, it was almost tasteless to think about the lower class.
Well, it wasn't even just archaeology, but even our perceptions of Rome today were influenced by how they interacted with Rome, in particular Pompeii, because the lower classes were the enemy.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah.
And so the fact that we see the liberty rising in power was interpreted as a sign that Rome was in decline. which I know I've heard about.
Yeah.
And that was really not the case. This was actually the opposite case. In many respects, it was an indication that Rome was on the rise.
And I kind of think of it as how today we place so much focus economically on the middle class and how the middle class is doing. That's usually seen as a sign of how well the economy overall is doing. And it's interesting that if we were to place Victorian prejudices on modern times, it would almost be seen as the opposite. If the middle class was doing well, it would be seen as a decline
Right.
in how the country or city or whatever is doing.
Right. And so if the middlers were so important to this change into the economy and they aren't as represented in the records, how do we find out about them? Through
Well,
archaeology.
yeah, and they talk about data archaeology, which I've never actually heard of it in that term.
No, me either. I think
Um,
it's almost sounds like a made up term to help make it clear to other readers what they're talking about.
Right, because to me this is just archaeology.
It's just statistical analysis,
Yeah,
which doesn't
yeah.
roll off the tongue as well either.
Yeah,
So that could
right,
be part of it
true.
too.
But it's just the observation and aggregation of information about everything you find, the structures, the different objects, and it gives you the typical behaviors, typical habits of a individual.
Right.
Not any specific individual, just this is probably what the everyday life of a normal Pompeian was like at this time period.
Example of a kind of a more modern example, one that I've used myself, is if you are investigating a homestead that the home is gone now, but you know there was a building here, and you find a nail. The single nail doesn't tell you very much, but if you find 1,000 nails, you can do analysis on those 1,000 nails and get indication of, was it a wooden structure? Did they use lath? Did they have shingles? You can get all kinds of little details from all that information together that you wouldn't get from any single nail.
Yeah.
And it's similar, only on a much larger, more complicated scale when we're talking about all of Pompeii, basically.
And he points out that it makes life more tangible, and it's the democratization of history, which, yeah, I mean, I can see that because you're
Mhm.
focusing more on the everyday life of the people that live there. And honestly, I don't know if it would be majority, but it seems like it would have been the majority of people were middlers, liberty, things like that, at least at the time.
I forget the number, but I believe she said they definitely was.
Yeah.
So we start, one of the ways that the archaeologists are looking at this is looking at the streets themselves.
Oh, which are
This
fascinating.
was very cool. So
Yeah.
essentially, Pompeii had so many parts that they actually wore grooved tracks in the stone roads. And that tells us a few things. One is that wheel widths were pretty standardized, which is interesting. Or at least there were social norms for accepted ways of driving in cities.
Yeah, the notching on the curbs on the
Yes.
right-hand side, very similar to us, how, if you don't turn, if you turn too soon or something like that, turning right, you're going to hit the curb.
Right. The much sharper turn on the right,
Right.
left, you wouldn't ever do that on.
Right. And so they started noticing all these notches on the right-hand side of right-hand curbs. And so it suggests that they probably drove on the right-hand side.
Yeah. I think it sounds like very strong evidence that was the case.
And I also love the discussion on the stepping stones as crosswalks.
Yes.
And you can imagine that these streets were full of dirty water,
Sounded like they're almost sewers in themselves.
Yeah, like
Open air sewers. that
Yeah,
you drove
essentially.
carts through. Yeah.
And the carts would drive through them, and you're thinking, well, Barbara, if the stepping stones were crosswalks, how did these carts get over the stepping stones?
Right.
And they had little spaces, little gaps
Mhm.
for where the carts would go through. So you could step on the stepping stones and you probably had to kind of hop over these little gaps. But that allowed the pedestrians to be above all the stuff that was flowing in the street.
Right. But here's a question for you, as someone who knows horses. How would the horses get past those? Because if the cart straddles the stone, where does the horse go? It has to step up on the stone and go down?
I guess it would depend on how wide the stones were. I only imagine them as being like a foot or two wide.
I
But,
looked up the picture and it looks like they were the width of the cart wheels, basically.
oh, well, I mean,
Like-
a horse could probably step up over them.
Right. And then it's tracking all the gunk onto the stone. I wasn't quite picturing Unless they were hitching their horses in a different way, a little wider or something too.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
wasn't quite picturing how that part worked, but
yeah, I don't know. I mean, horses can walk over things pretty easy
right.
and step
It
up
was
over it, but yeah,
some of
like,
them were quite a step up, but
yeah.
yeah.
Or, I mean, they wouldn't go through the grooves. That would be too narrow. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, a
But
history mystery.
yeah, but I just thought it was really cool that they were like, oh, yeah, let's raise the stepping stones.
Right.
It just shows like series of problem solving that I thought
I
was
also
pretty
wonder
interesting.
about like elderly folks that aren't maybe not as mobile.
Yeah.
How would that work in those cases? Maybe, yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of questions I have, and there were probably answers to all of these things.
Oh, and then they talk about the paving of the roads. Only the main streets would have been paved, it appears, and the streets on the western side were paved, and the streets on the eastern side were dirt. And they talked about how that would have been the eastern side was where you find like more elaborate villas and things like that. That was obviously like the rich side of town. And then there was a whole discussion about how the rich were only willing to share the back of their homes with the poor, and they can kind of tell that by whether or not the streets were paved and where they were
Mm-hmm.
paved
Yeah.
around the main entrances of these homes. So even just something as simple as like street paving can
Right.
tell you so much. And they had I thought of you when they started talking about how absences
Mm-hmm.
can say a lot. And I was like, Tristan always says negative data is still data.
Even though it makes us sad. But that's not
Right.
even, this isn't even negative data. This is a thing we try to talk about a lot about how you can look at what you have and figure out what is missing.
I could
That's
just see like an archaeologist digging and they're looking for pavers and there's like, there's no pavers
right, right,
here.
right. I thought they actually I quoted them on this. I thought it was pretty nice. And I thought about the absences in my home city that mark the places where crowds gather. Bald trails worn through park grass, the dings in subway paint where commuters have whacked their bags into the walls repeatedly, and yes, the scars in the streets where cars turn too quickly or bounced as they hit the bottom of one of San Francisco's many steep hills. As you listen to this too, think about in your own home, in your own community, where are little clues to different behaviors, especially behaviors that happen a lot that you wouldn't necessarily find buried in the ground. And there's a lot of behavior that happens that way. We always talk about how there's so much that doesn't enter the archaeological record, but a lot of it we can figure out by what does.
Yeah, think about, common areas where people gather like parks and things like that. You probably would find some archaeological data, but it would not be nearly as dense as say the area where the houses surrounding the park were. And that data tells you just as much as all the data you can find within the houses.
Mm-hmm. And then moving on to the next section, this is where we actually talk about how many liberty were actually in Rome.
Yes.
So they've recently figured out how much of the population was liberty by looking at the names on every gravestone in Rome and a few other places.
Which I love this.
I liked it, but I thought it was complete overkill.
Yeah.
You don't have to do that. There's statistical sampling would
Right.
have been plenty fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't resent anyone doing that, but it's also really not necessary.
But they also talked about how they would get kicked off the grain dole so you could see how much like the population would shrink in size and
That's one way, yes.
yeah, so looking at documentation and even just trends and numbers on documentation, certain types of documentation can tell you a lot. And yes, archaeologists do
But
use documentation when it's available to us.
Right, yes, absolutely. The gravestones themselves, essentially, when people were enslaved, they were given Greek-like names, typically. And then when they were freed, they often had a indicator of an L,
On there, yeah.
or they actually incorporated their former master's name into their name as well. So all that was clue on who was liberty. And I guess, and we see indication of this later that their children tended to abandon all of that because they didn't want to be tied with that anymore.
But I guess it determined that like 3/4 were ex-slave or their descendants. And then another study determined it to be about 30%. So either way, there was quite a significant population of liberty.
Well, actually, I picked up on this. So from the stones, they got 3/4 of all free people were liberty or descendants of liberty. Another estimate is 30% of all people.
Right.
So 3/4 of free people or 30% of all people, it statistically, it's a kind of a confusing way of presenting that because they don't actually contradict each other necessarily even.
And I also wonder, like, we already made that comment about descendants, and a lot of their children were dropping any indication of them being Liberty, or their parents being Liberty. So how that one is 3/4 were determined to be ex-slaves or their descendants. And I want to know exactly how they determined descendants.
Yeah, good question. But I want to hit that point a little more too, because it's important when you're reading this book. 30% of all people, that included rich people and slaves in that case.
Right.
So the statistics are not, they may be the same result essentially, but the way they analyzed them they don't complement each other. You can't compare these two numbers essentially is what I'm trying to say.
Right. This kind of leads into the conversation of, I put keeping up with the Joneses. We already mentioned how the descendants would often drop any indicators saying that they were descended from Liberty. They wanted to be seen as kind of wealthy within their own right, because a lot of times Liberty did have the ability to accumulate quite a lot of wealth, but they weren't. I equated this, being from West Palm, as like the nouveau riche versus like the those that have inherited their wealth.
Right. I made a note. This sounds pretty middle class to me.
Right.
Actually.
Yeah.
So the middlers and middle class is, I'm not sure the distinction is necessary almost sometimes.
But like the Liberty would often build houses that kind of tried to blend in with the rich, but I guess you can kind of see the differences, quality, things like that. Or it would be like they would look, rich from the outside, but not necessarily on the inside kind of thing. And there was a fresco of middlers that they found that was painted in an elite style, but they were holding tools of their trade, showing kind of their former servitude. And this was seen as both powerful and defiant. So you can kind of see how, we see it today, and like people are proud to be like part of the working class or proud of their trade. And there's organizations dedicated to those trades. And it's a point of pride for people. So, it's kind of saying, yeah, we were slaves, but look what we've accomplished, and I thought that was just kind of interesting. And then you move into later on the children kind of just being like, nope, we're just wealthy.
Right. Related to this was the brothers who painted.
Oh boy, how do we?
Let's just try it, and if we don't like it, I'll take it out.
Okay, I didn't take a ton of notes on that.
There's not a lot to write anyway. Another villa in a similar vein had on the fresco on the very front of their house, owned by what they think was two brothers, had a story of called Priapus, who weighed his phallus on a scale, and it was essentially a display of, this is not working real well. All right, let me try one more time, and if it doesn't work, we'll ditch this one. In a similar vein, there's another villa with a fresco, probably owned by two brothers, also Liberty, that displays a Greek or Roman story about someone weighing his phallus on a scale. And it is comically outsized. And in this case, it's not seen as obscene. It's still low-class humor, they think, but it's not as we would interpret that today. So essentially, it's a brag about their success, but it's also a reminder of their low-class origins as well. So again, they think that is basically doing the same thing, only it's a little more difficult to talk about on a podcast.
And in pre-Christian Roman culture, erotic paintings, displays, knickknacks, all that kind of stuff was really, really common. And I thought it was funny. They had a discussion about the Naples Museum and this special secret cabinet that up until very recently, I guess,
2000.
A lot of these objects were kept locked up because they were considered like inappropriate for the public.
Right.
So even today, we have a very different view on this stuff than what the Romans at Pompeii would have had. This would have been all over the place. It would have been, it probably would have gotten attention, but it wouldn't have been as taboo as what we would think of it today.
Right. And we move on to Amorus's bar, which is another case of liberty business, essentially. He works in the neighboring villa and gave it a facelift, but they did it as cheaply as possible. I think you referenced this earlier. So restored the dining room and The atrium roof was built as cheaply as it could, so it was just hay and plaster, I think.
Yeah.
And it was such poor condition that the pool actually wouldn't hold water. It was just he used it for storage. And also, this is the one where they turned the bedroom into stables. I said that wrong earlier. So basically, you can kind of imagine this stately manor, or the remains of it, with like a cheap finish put on top and rebuilt, and then it's just used for everyday work and everything. But there's still apparently some effort to maintain this illusion of class, of like we talked about, trying to put on airs. Maybe. Yeah. His customers were likely other liberty, so this was on a side street, wasn't on one of the main streets. And they actually, again, I think you'll like this, they analyzed the cooking pots.
I like this.
The cesspit, actually.
Yes.
To figure out what was being served, and they found lots of remains of fish, nuts, and figs, which are all very staple items. High quality, grown locally, that kind of thing. He did have a single bottle of imported wine from Gaza.
Which I love how the author kind of talks about this. You can just imagine him coming out, like maybe he had some important guests or some buddies of his there or something.
Or he was trying to see if there's maybe a market for this.
Yeah, he was just trying something new. Hey guys, what do you think about this?
Yeah, offer the customers a little something different. I noted that, that was a not bad case, because there's authors making conjecture, but it was clear, and they're very clear about this is kind of like, maybe this is how it was, or,
Yep.
And I like that. Also, indication that he participated in politics. They found a sign with his name outside the shop, which again, we are kind of wondering about. This one works a little better because it says the shop owner supports someone else. Although both names were misspelled, this is where I didn't like the conjecture, because it was, maybe the guy who painted it was a little drunk, because next door was a paint shop, and maybe he gave him wine in exchange for the paint. And I'm like, all right, let's reel it in a little bit here. This is getting a little too much for me.
Yeah, and I think, people misspell things
it
all
happens
the time.
All the time. It doesn't have to involve alcohol.
It doesn't have to involve alcohol. And also, I appreciate the fact that they do make mention that it was spelled differently, because I think oftentimes when we're doing historical research or transcribing something, we have this desire to correct what we think is a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And then over time, it gets forgotten about that it was spelled differently. Say a headstone, somebody goes out to a headstone and CLARKE,
right.
And they're like, oh no, that must be CLARK. And then over time, it becomes CLARK. And then somebody goes out to the headstone and they get utterly confused because they see the E, So I think it's important to at least make mention when there are spelling differences and things. But to make conjecture based on the differences, I think is kind of taking it a possible step too far. So yeah, people misspelled things.
Right. It happened all the time. Still happens all the time.
Yeah.
Happens more now that I rely on spell check.
Right.
So. And so then now we move into the truly not safe for work section. So just be warned.
Right.
Because we move into the prostitute building, not really a district in this case. Right.
And that's what makes this kind of unique.
Right.
I love too that. So it's a brothel and it's called a lupanar. I think I'm pronouncing that right. But it actually translates to the she-wolf's den.
Right.
Which I just thought was amazing. And it was purpose built for this purpose, which is quite unusual for the time, I guess.
Apparently, it's the only case of this found in all of Roman archaeology so far.
Which is cool. And it was really common for liberty to become sex workers.
And slaves, too.
Yeah.
I think.
Some of the workers would have been slaves that didn't have a choice, but it's important to mention that a lot of sex workers did this by choice, essentially. You can argue how much choice they actually had based on their status and things like that. But they did seem to take some pride in their work, which is evident by a lot of the graffiti that we see inside this brothel, which was often written by the women from the women's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to note that female literacy was actually common in Pompeii. But yeah, some of the graffiti boasts about their sexual prowess. They would write their names on the wall in a prominent way, the way a prominent man would, with a dot separating the words, which I guess was common for like political figures and things like that.
I feel like the dot was an extra. I think the way they're writing it, the letters themselves too, was also significant, but the book didn't describe that, just said it was overall.
Yeah. So they were trying to make a statement
Right.
about their prominence within the community, which I thought was
And
really
their
interesting.
power.
Yeah,
I like that this was the most visited area of Pompeii
of
because
course.
I have my three P's that will always draw a crowd, which is prostitutes, pirates, and poltergeists.
Yeah.
And so this is definitely drawing that crowd.
And again, this is a great example of archaeology being used to understand like the everyday person. And they have a great, some of, because these women would write graffiti and put their names on the walls and stuff. And so we actually know a lot of the names of these sex workers, whereas we don't necessarily know the names of her clients who paid her, which is kind of fascinating to me. And she has a quote that says, "And the names of sex workers like Murtis would be remembered for thousands of years, while the names of her clients burned into to the dust,"
Right.
which I thought was really kind of powerful way to put it.
I like that they would give themselves titles too,
Oh,
which
goodness.
we're not going to say this one out loud, but Queen of Sex Act, for example. But I got a kick out of that as well. And I want to point out too that this is very different from how like red light districts worked in more recent history as well.
Yeah.
The status is different, the way they're run was different, but archaeology involving those districts are actually also very important because again, it's the unwritten story. It is, for example, Pensacola, Florida, nearby here, had a red light district well beyond most places in the US. And I know of an archaeologist did work on some of the artifacts that came from that area, and she found, they had these women had kids, they had pets, there was pet licenses found. Basically, it just really brought home the idea that they were people, which if you read the historic records, you may not get that impression necessarily. They weren't worthwhile, but that is not the case.
And well, she discusses too how like this is a fundamental issue with
Yes.
the way we do study our history or any history. We kind of things that we deem inappropriate by today's standards and values or things that maybe make us a little uncomfortable. We look at them with our own eyes rather than within the context that created them, and we kind of forget about them, brush them
or
under the
lock
rug.
them away, as in the
Yeah.
case of the Victorian
And
stuff.
it was interesting to me as I was reading this because I've seen a lot of Facebook posts lately about like, if history doesn't occasionally make you uncomfortable, then you aren't actually studying history in its full context and things like that.
Yeah, you're not studying the culture on its own terms. You're studying it only on your terms in
Yeah.
that case.
Yeah.
That's a good point to make too.
Ooh, but then we get into a conversation about public toilets.
Yes, I actually kind of got a kick out of this one.
Me too. And it's interesting because I never really thought about like the advent of public toilets, right?
Right.
It's kind of something we expect to see. And when we don't find a public toilet, we get annoyed.
Yeah, no kidding.
But it was nothing like the toilets of today. Privacy was different back then. It would have been a common bench essentially with like a trough running below it.
And running water below it too.
Yeah. So
Which I wonder how is that kept separate from the drinking water, but
yeah.
I don't know.
There's a lot of questions about
Right.
sanitation in
Right.
this time period.
Any time period, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, it would have had water underneath it. There's no privacy walls between the toilets. And the toilets were mostly reserved for men. And the most disgusting thing to me is they would have used a shared sponge on a stick.
Yep. You
to
dip
wipe.
it in the water and you take care of it and then you set it back for the next person to use. Yeah. And also, this was not like every street corner had one of these. This was something that only showed up in like the forum and places where they didn't want people just using the floor. Because otherwise, I guess they did just kind of go wherever they felt like.
Yeah.
In the alleys, in the streets.
And
there was no real restriction on that.
she had a great quote. It's on page 123 if you're following along, but it said, "Often it is the most squalid and filthiest of places that we can uncover profound truths about a society that considers themselves civilized." And I was just like, oh gosh, what will people think of us in the future, right? Because I'm sure at the time this was just amazing. Like what a cool little feat of technology.
Right.
And almost, I mean, it's a social construct in certain ways, right? We want to keep the forum clean and sightly, so let's kind of hide away something that in every other area of the city we're just doing in public. But yeah, they were very concerned with like regulating space, and like they saw public toilets as a way to kind of do that.
I feel like the regulation of space in Roman culture is like a whole book on itself.
Yeah, and I guess it kind of intensifies around this time. Like public spaces are kind of part of Rome's identity, right? Like, and when we think of Rome, a lot of the things that we think of, the Colosseum and things like that, are public spaces. So this is a time when constructing things that are meant for public, I guess it's kind of, how would I say it, is larger than life. I don't know. It just, you get a lot of public spaces that are built for very specific purposes.
Yeah, and then public spaces for the public, but also kind of regulations on how you interact with the public spaces.
Yeah, and like there were both written rules, but then there were also like kind of social norms that you were expected to follow.
Like any society too.
Yeah.
That's how we all kind of work. Yeah.
What I found was interesting is when after Mount Vesuvius erupted, they lost kind of part of their identity as people were, the refugees, the ones that were able to escape Pompeii, when they were resettling, they kind of lost that identity. They lost their public spaces that were familiar to them.
And that was part of the trauma.
Yeah, that was part of the trauma. And so when they moved to other cities, you see them constructing new versions of these spaces that they had lost, which I thought was interesting. And that's probably a good segue into chapter 6 if we want to get started with that.
Which is the bit of history or parts of the history everybody knows about Pompeii. And this is where we deal with the eruption and everything. This happened in the fall of 79 BCE, and it started as an earthquake, which probably wouldn't have been very alarming to the residents because, like we talked about, they have them fairly frequently there. And then Mount Vesuvius starts to smoke. So this is interesting because there are no other Roman records of a volcano erupting, which I'm surprised with their long history they didn't run into that elsewhere.
Yeah, I was too. I guess so this was really somewhat alarming because they had not,
right,
at least within maybe their
remembered history.
Right. Yeah. They hadn't really encountered. So this was when it became alarming. And it was interesting because I was just curious about the timeline and everything like that. There's a couple computer generated models of what that would have, like simulated experiences online where you can watch videos and things. They're on YouTube about what it would have been like. And it does kind of just start, it wasn't something that just immediately happened, right? And I was thinking when I was in Ecuador this past December, there was a volcano erupting while I was there. And when we were flying, you could see the smoke, and I was like, well, this is a little alarming. But everybody in Ecuador was just kind of going about their daily life, so you can just imagine like an earthquake happened. They were like, oh man, I have to kind of clean up the mess the earthquake made. But then they went about their day, and then like there was another shock. So there were several different shocks, and then it started smoking, and then what we know to have happened, and it was devastating.
Yeah, and so there's some kind of maybes in this exact timeline. So the sky might have filled with smoke for a day or two, and then launched rocks as big as street pavers, basically, and where it started falling on you. And that's when I would start to get especially worried, because if I'm close enough for rocks to fall on me, then I'm like,
you're too close.
I don't want to be there. Earthquakes continued, and so at this point, people started to panic and leave, and they moved mostly north and inland.
And I think it's really important to point out, too, we're talking about Pompeii, but Herculaneum, I don't know if I'm saying that right, that was another city that was actually closer to Mount Vesuvius and was impacted as well.
And that was even more a villa type place.
Yeah.
So a lot of wealthy and their servants and slaves and things.
And I think we just focus more on Pompeii because, as you know, there were a lot of really interesting archaeological remains. Which
preservations are probably better. Yeah. So yeah, people started to leave, but many stayed behind, either because by choice or because they were under orders to do so. And at some point, it said a meter of ash and rocks had collected in the streets. And I think that's the time when you would say, it's time to go.
Yeah, I think I would be gone before that.
I think so too.
A meter is a lot of ash.
That's a lot, yeah. However, it's important to think about, we think of Pompeii as like a flash frozen thing, and that's not actually how it was at all. Everything was in disarray. People were evacuating and panicking. And even the people that were left behind, they didn't get frozen in their place. They laid down and died,
Yeah, because it wasn't necessarily being covered in ash that killed you. There was a lot of the air was toxic, the ash was
Hmm.
toxic, fumes, things falling on you.
Yeah.
Like it was chaotic. It wasn't just like something that happened in like instantaneously.
And in Herculaneum,
This kind of broke my heart talking about
yeah,
Herculaneum.
they
Ugh.
they found warehouses on the docks that were filled with dozens of bodies of people.
Waiting for rescue.
Right. And actually people were coming on rescue boats and those people died too.
So it was interesting to me that only, so many people did evacuate, but there's really only one known written account by Pliny the Younger. And I think he talks about how his, I believe, uncle was one of
Yeah.
the people that was taking boats to go try and rescue people. And a lot of people that were rescuing people were also hurt or injured or died.
But that we talked about the toxic gas and everything, but the final blow for everyone in Pompeii was what's called a pyroclastic flow. And that is essentially blasts of superheated gas that blasts out and essentially instantly cooks everyone and all the animals left behind.
Yeah, it killed every living thing within 10 kilometers around Mount Vesuvius.
Yep. After this does its work, ash continues to fall, burying Pompeii to 6 meters. And, hot and toxic gases and the bodies would decay underneath this, leaving kind of a mold, basically.
Yeah, like a plaster cast,
right.
kind of.
So they aren't finding the bodies themselves, they're finding the mold of the bodies.
Yeah. And then along comes Giuseppe Fiorelli in the 1860s. He was an archaeologist, and he's the one who pumped plaster into those hollows to recreate some of the people, like what's left of the people. They're essentially, he recreates the positions, and even their facial expressions are able to be seen in these plaster casts, which is just crazy. And it's interesting that some like anticipated their death. You can see like the fear on their face or whatever. And then others, it looks like they died while they were sleeping, which I would want to know exactly. I was kind of surprised by that because like you've been having earthquakes and stuff all day and you're just taking a nap. Like they just kind of be like,
they
okay,
just
this is
suffocated
it.
and weren't even aware.
Yeah. But so all these refugees poured into nearby cities. And I mean, if you've watched the news, you can only imagine like what that would have been like back in this time period. But one thing I found interesting was the generation of silence he talks about, or she talks about in the book. So one reason, I mentioned before that the only written documentation we have is from Pliny the Younger. And you would think with so many people that survived, there would be a lot of written accounts, but it doesn't seem to be something that was talked about a lot, which I guess it's common to see a generation of silence, as they call it, after the wake of a disaster. And it just can be interpreted to show how traumatizing it was. I mean, a lot of these people had what we call PTSD today.
Yeah, and it can't just be like a disaster. It has to be like a society-wide trauma.
Like Rome
basically
was powerful, Rome was rich, and this could not be solved with money or politics or even
military.
manpower.
Yeah, it was entirely beyond their control.
Yeah, and she goes into talking about how, because a lot of people are like, well, why didn't they just, rebuild Pompeii? Were people scared? Were they thinking it was supernatural forces? Things like that. And the Romans were pretty pragmatic. They had rebuilt after the initial earthquake in 62, but she goes into talking about how it would have taken generations to clean it up. It would have been massive. Like we said, 6 meters of ash fell on this place. So the manpower it would have taken to dig it out. Also, the toxic fumes and particulates. So anybody that would have been working in that area would have gotten super sick. She goes on to talking about how the soil would have been essentially damaged to the point where you couldn't really grow anything in it because of all the toxic fumes and stuff from the eruption. So it wasn't just like you could just go back and be like, all right, clean it up, let's start over.
So a few details. Ash is way more dense than snow, and so just the weight of it would have been pretty remarkable. Also, it started at 340 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
And then all the ash and the rock on top of that,
and it's
insulates it, and it would have been the actual lava flow, it was mostly what she was talking about, would have been hot for a long, long time.
Yeah, and which would have also continued to contribute to the toxic fumes. Yeah, it wasn't practical.
Yeah, and then there are wider environmental problems too, like you alluded to with the farmland, for example, but also even like clogged waterways full of ash. And now all of a sudden, you have either floods or you have water that is not reaching other communities that rely on it, and all kinds of other things.
And it's important to note, yeah, like this would have affected the entire region of Naples Bay and just.
And even with today's technology, we couldn't have recovered from this.
Well, and the author
basically
mentions Mount St. Helen
Mhm.
and how even 40 years after that eruption, hardly anything is growing nearby.
And that was similar, I guess, in some respects, as far
Yeah.
as the pyroclastic flow and the ash falling and stuff.
But yeah, she talks about scene afterwards and how it would have been familiar to anybody who has experienced a natural disaster
Mhm.
today, you know, the hurricanes, wildfires, and, you know, sick and weak people taking shelter wherever they can. And the government's response was very similar to what we would, I love how she says, what we would hope for in Western democracies
Right.
today. I was like, yeah.
That's an interesting way of putting that.
Yeah. But the emperor even toured the disaster site and offered like financial support to survivors and built new neighborhoods for refugees in several of the like surrounding coastal cities.
Mhm.
And they even constructed temples that were dedicated to like popular Pompeii gods like Venus and Isis. And
Well, and immediately after, when refugees were arriving,
Yeah.
they actually opened up temples and coliseums to shelter the people,
yeah.
which again, that's, we see them opening football stadiums and stuff for that same purpose in these cases.
And I didn't quite understand, and maybe you can clarify this for me, Tristan, but it said that money came from the government, but it also came from properties that were extinguished by Vesuvius.
It means from if someone owned property outside of Vesuvius and they died in Pompeii, then
Okay.
that property still has value but no owner.
Gotcha. 'Cause
That's
I
what
was
I
like,
understood that as.
okay, that makes more sense because I was like, if if the
Right.
property is under 6 meters of ash, how is this any help? But
Right.
okay, that makes more sense. But yeah, a lot of the money came from that, so you can see that it probably was like quite the financial sum.
Could
to
have been
help with
quite a lot,
this.
yes.
Yeah, help with this relief effort.
Well, and then some of the people, a lot of the Liberty were actually not in the city when it went, and they were actually managing the patron's property elsewhere. And in some cases, they just continued managing that property. It kind of became theirs, it seems like.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm wondering, it would be interesting to see how Pompeii, the eruption of Vesuvius, may have helped upward mobility of some of the Liberty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, very few wrote of the trauma. But what I thought was interesting is how some of the Liberty kind of held on to their identity as Pompeians. But then I guess, as you mentioned, they stopped kind of using
Their children kind of abandoned it.
Yeah, abandoned the nomenclature associated with liberty because they wanted to just kind of be seen as building family wealth within their own right.
Well, and interestingly, too, part of this recovery effort was to essentially build them whole new neighborhoods that were like Pompeii refugee neighborhoods. Like you said, with temples and stuff even.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the Pompeii identity seemed to exist for quite a while, although it seems like the remnant culture of the original owners of the city was pretty much wiped out.
Yeah, and I guess when they moved, obviously left Pompeii, they kind of sought out cities that were very similar to the ones that, the communities that they had lost within Pompeii, which is drastically different from Catalhayuk, where they were like, yeah, we don't like this high density urban life. We're moving back
We're
to
done
rural.
with this nonsense. Yeah. And so in this case, like they were pretty deep into urban style of living. Many of them had never known any other way of living, really, and moving around wasn't even really a thing in Roman times, I don't think. Rome itself. One of the things that shows kind of the effort of recovery was Puteoli was one of the cities that the refugees tended to head towards. And again, built a new road and neighborhoods and meeting houses for them, but also a full copy of the Colosseum in Rome, which with I would have had to been with floodable floors and everything for naval battles, which is mind-boggling that
Yeah.
they put that much money into it.
Yeah. I cannot even imagine because we're in Florida, we've experienced storm damage and things like that, but we know it's coming. Even today with volcanic eruptions, we know that it's a possibility. We have scientists that give us data and they understand how to measure these things and everything. But the trauma that these people must have felt had to have been just unbelievable.
Yeah, and interestingly, it was a trauma of not even just them, but of like the whole empire too.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons it's not written about, because everyone felt this in varying ways.
Yeah.
I thought the whole generation of silence thing was a little far-fetched, but then she pointed out that we had similar response with the Spanish flu, which, yeah, how many people really know about the Spanish flu before COVID?
Right. Before COVID, it wasn't really something that anybody but maybe historians or somebody who studies epidemiology or something would have understood or
I only
known
knew
about.
a little bit. I knew we lost a relative basically to it. That's about the limit of what I knew.
I knew it happened.
Right.
But honestly, it was from watching historical dramas.
Right.
Because I'm a nerd. But I do love how she closes this chapter. She's visiting. This is a place that even today is on a lot of people's bucket lists of places to travel to. So it's very, very touristy. And you go around and she mentions how people were speaking different languages and kids were running through the streets and people were sticking their heads in these replica fountains. And she just imagines that's what it must have kind of been like 2,000 years ago, because it was a place where people from different areas of the world came to congregate, at least the Roman world of that time. And she concludes with mentioning how bad it must have smelled in the streets.
Yeah.
An unpleasant soup of garbage, wastewater, and poop from every animal in the city, including humans.
Yep.
And, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Just a lot of questions I have about the drinking water versus sanitation versus disposal of waste. It makes we see it as this Roman Empire, bustling, lively, the middlers or middle class growing, but also what was she doesn't make any mention of how prominent disease was or anything like that. Yeah. Parasites, things like that, how prevalent they were. They had to have been very prevalent because within almost every urban environment that we see early on, they talked about with cattle hayuk, there's an uptick in pests and things like that spread disease. So I would have loved to have learned more about that aspect of it.
And to be clear, that's not necessarily a criticism of the book in this case. She has to choose what she talks about because... Yeah,
I mean, that could probably be a book in and of itself.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
And I know there are books like that about that. But it was just something as I'm reading through this, I'm like, wonder how gross it was.
Yeah. Well, I think that wraps us up. What did you think of the Pompeii? Any closing thoughts on this section or anything?
So first of all, there was so much I was never taught in school about Pompeii.
And Roman culture in general.
Yeah, we get this very kind of Cliff Notes version of Roman history and history about Pompeii. And I never knew that there were earthquakes beforehand. And I didn't know about the relief effort, which is something I'm kind of surprised we don't talk about a lot more. I remember I must have watched some documentary a while ago, and I remember them talking about Herculaneum and the people trying to evacuate on boats. But I wish I would be interested in learning more about Herculaneum as well, just because they were closer to the eruption and seeing what differences and similarities there were in the relief efforts for those two cities. I think that might be interesting. And like I said, I watched a few virtual recreations of the eruption, and those were interesting. Who knows how accurate they are, right? Because I watched a couple of them and they were all very different. But if you're interested, it is something to kind of seek out, and it gives you a feel of what it must have been like. There was one where there were dogs barking and stuff like that. And I'm like, yeah, that's probably how it was.
Right.
You could hear children playing, and then ceiling, roof tiles start falling and people start screaming, and it was interesting. But yeah, I don't know how accurate they are.
Yeah. I felt like last time we had a pattern for where the kind of guesswork was going and then more nuance was added. I didn't quite get a sense of that pattern this time. Kind of the guesswork was a little bit scattered throughout, but it was it maybe about the same amount?
I honestly, yeah, there was a lot of guesswork, but there wasn't as much going back and saying, okay, that was just guesswork.
Right.
And I kind of, to me, it lent itself more to like that Roman kind of romanticism. We make these stories up about Roman life. And I wonder, honestly, if the way we think about Roman culture today and how we kind of almost idealize it influenced the author some. I don't know, but it just seemed like, there were instances where we had these very detailed descriptions of these people based on just a name on a fresco or something like that.
Like
and
the house of Julia Felix, all that information was based off of 48 words.
Right.
Which is not a lot to go on for, I think they made an okay case for like she was making her own decision things, but still 48 words is not a lot. So I'm a little more skeptical of some of that, but still, there were plenty examples of doing a good job of making clear that this was conjecture as well. So yeah, I enjoyed it a lot. I think my favorite stuff is when they got into the kind of detailed stuff, like this is how the streets work and this is how the toilets worked. And for some reason that really found that kind of cool and interesting, how we got all that little detail from things.
Yeah, I was very fascinated by the streets. And I love urban planning anyways. That was my minor in undergrad. So anytime you start talking about streets and the layout of a city and like how like the engineering of that type of stuff is just fascinating to me. And I think it's interesting too that they recreated the fountains for the tourists, because that seems like just such a touristy thing to do. Like we'll leave like the archaeology of the houses and stuff like that, but the pretty fountains, which, if you've been to Rome or you've been anywhere in Europe, fountains are the thing.
I wonder when the fountains were built though, too, right?
Yeah, I want to say she might make mention of that, but I can't remember. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it was just kind of funny to me that that's one of the things they recreated.
Right. Well, I think that wraps us up for this time. Next time, we're going to move on to a new city. Which one is it this time, Barbara?
I believe it is Anchor.
Anchor. Okay. This is one I know nothing about beyond what's in the introduction.
I'm really excited about this one just because when I was visiting Thailand, I wanted to make it into Cambodia and see Angkor Wat, which I think is just the temple. I know Wat means temple, but we're going to be talking about the entire city of Angkor. So I'm really excited about that. I don't know anything about it, except I know it is a World Heritage Site. I know that at least the temple is.
All of these have been so far.
Yeah, so I'm interested to learn about things other than just the temple.
I feel like this almost fits the premise of the book a little bit better in some regards too, because this was another slow decline. And I'm interested to see a bit more about why that happens, because, the Pompeii decline was pretty obvious, even though she did a good job of adding some more nuance to why that happened. But this one's going to be an even better example, I think, and almost more comparable to Catahayuk, I wonder.
Yeah, and I will make mention again of the really beautiful illustration. There's snakes. It's almost like a little map of Angkor and a lot of really cool imagery. So if you're reading the book, this might be something that is useful to refer back to, it looks like, because it does seem like a map. So just keep that in mind when you're reading this. You can go back to the beginning of that section and maybe refer back to the illustration.
All right. I think that wraps up this podcast. Once again, thank you all for listening, and let us know if you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Archaeology Books for Fun is brought to you by the Florida Public Archaeology Network, a program of the University of West Florida. You can find out more about archaeology and about FPAN at fpan.us. We appreciate any feedback, so if you're listening to us as a podcast, please leave us a review, and if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening.